Okej, vi sätter igång så smått. Vi är väl medvetna om att ibland så kommer folk in någon minut sent, och det är inte enbart för att de har startat för sent utan också att det är lite svårt att hitta hit. Men vi kör ändå igång och tänkte alldeles kort bara inleda med att som ni vet, det är några få dagar kvar till klimatförhandlingarna i Paris, där Fores kommer finnas på plats i stort sett hela tiden med olika många personer. Vi kommer att ordna 2 seminarier där nere, ett som handlar om fossilfri fordonsflotta och ett som handlar om hur företagens klimatarbete kan bidra till att minska det här gapet, utsläppsgapet mellan så att säga de policies som finns och de utsläppsnivåer vi behöver nå. Och ni följer allt som händer på många olika ställen, men jag tycker att klimatförhandling.se kan vara en av era favoritmarkerade sidor under de här 2 veckorna. Och med det sagt så tänkte jag då switch to English since we have international guests here. Gernot. Yeah, I didn't tell you, no? Sorry. With just a few days to the COP21, a meeting this morning described by our Prime Minister as the most important international meeting of this government, one could hope that everyone would be discussing climate policy everywhere. We all know that that's not the case. The world seems quite a messy place, and Swedish politics is perhaps at the moment not that encouraging. But nonetheless, we at Forest, we take every chance to learn more, to hear new perspectives, to stimulate discussion on new policy proposals. Last week we published a policy paper on a tool that might be a tiny, small piece in the jigsaw puzzle that will help us combat climate change. It's called Snabbare avskrivningar, and you can find it over there. But today we are discussing, I would say, more of the broader picture. What do we know about the risks of climate change? How to deal with uncertainty? What are the best global solutions when trying to combat climate change? And therefore, I'm very pleased to have Gernot Wagner, who's the lead senior economist at the Environmental Defense Fund in New York. He also do research and teaching at the Harvard Kennedy School and Columbia University. And it's actually Gernot's second time here. He was also participating in a conference on carbon markets that we organized back in 2010 when Gernot discussed the linking of carbon markets, something that if you're a frequent visitor here, you know that that's something we tend to discuss here, and maybe Gernot will touch upon it also today. But foremost, he will talk about his new book, Climate Shock, that he has written together with Martin Weitzman. It's the book is on the Financial Times list of Business Book of the Year. It's been praised by Jeffrey Sachs, Will Nordhaus, Foreign Affairs, and many others. And I'm really looking forward to hear your presentation about the book. You know, I should have a copy of it, of course, but unfortunately,
we can rectify that.
You do, yeah. Adlibris has not been as up to speed as I would hope. Oh, there's the copy.
Here we go.
Thanks a lot. Here's the book. You can find it on Adlibris and Bokus and most other places. And before leaving the floor to Gernot, I'd also like to welcome Jonas Nykander, who is a professor in meteorology with a great interest in economic climate policy, and we thought it would be a nice mix to have a professor in meteorology with an interest in economic policy commenting on an economist with apparently an interest of methodology. So we hope that that will be an interesting discussion. We will hear from Gernot for 20 minutes or so. Then we will have a discussion with Gernot and Jonas, and then we will invite the audience for a few questions towards the end. And we hope to wrap this up around 4 o'clock. And after that, there will be some glögg and pepparkakor, etc. So Gernot, please.
Thank you. It's great to be back at Forus. So even though I'm young, I'm not that young, I guess, that it was it last decade or 2010?
2010, yeah.
I was here. Now, what I would like to do is, instead of talking about what we do know about climate change, and of course there's quite a lot, I'd like to talk about what we don't know. And in that spirit, let me start with a pop quiz. Not to put anyone on the spot, but other than the climatologist in the room here, what is this range? What is this set of numbers? Or who knows what it is? Yes, it's basically, I mean, it's a tightly defined parameter in some sense, sort of the one measure that defines the future of the planet as we know it. It is climate sensitivity, which is defined as what happens to global average temperatures, and both of these words matter, global and average, eventually in geological equilibrium, if you will, as concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere double. And of course, double they will, right? Unless we act, right? We started at 280 parts per million. We've crossed 400 for CO2 alone. And 560, the doubling will happen, right? Unless we act. There's always the unless we act attached, of course, right? What point is there in venturing predictions if all we do is sit around and wait for them to become true? But of course, this is where we are heading, a doubling of CO2, at least a doubling of CO2. And this is the global average temperature change, eventually, due to that doubling. Now, turns out that range has been with us for a while. Jule Chani, National Academy of Sciences study in the US, 1979. 2 studies available at the time, 2 credible studies. One said 2 degrees, the other one said 4 degrees. Add half a degree on either end, because why not? There are uncertainties. And this was the range given to us in a governmental panel on climate change, 1990, 1992, 1995, 2001. Right? Amazing advances in climate change, climate science, every step along the way. We know a lot more by now than we did in 1979 about a whole lot of things. But this parameter linking concentrations to temperatures has not changed. As a matter of fact, the range, the likely range, has not changed. By now, we have a better sense of what it means to be likely. The IPCC defines that as 66% probability, not 2/3, not 67. Don't ask why. 66% probability to be in this range, right? So by definition, being outside is unlikely, but of course, we can't necessarily exclude that. And as science would have it, right, we can cut things off at the lower end. Right? Adding CO2 isn't going to decrease temperatures, so we can certainly cut things off at 0. As a matter of fact, by now we've warmed by about 0.85 degrees centigrade, so we can certainly cut things off already at 0.8 degrees or 1 degree for that matter. Right? This is what happens eventually. It's not supposed to happen already. Unfortunately, we are not as lucky on the upper tail. Right? Now, this was 2001. Fast forward to the 4th IPCC assessment report, 2007. Right? Good news, bad news. Good news for science, tighten the range. Bad news for the rest of us. Looks like the lower end is out. Now, remember this number, 2007. October 2013, once again, right, hundreds of climate scientists in a room together. And we are back to where we were in 1979. apparently, in the good news, bad news sense of the world, we have unlearned. Now, turns out neither of these statements, in fact, was correct, right? It wasn't good news. If it were good news for science to narrow the range, then this would have to be bad news. It's not good or bad, it's just news, right? We've learned more, and that range has widened again. It just happens to be that this crucial parameter is deeply, persistently uncertain, very, very difficult to, in fact, narrow the range. The second bit, by the way, wasn't true either, what I just said before, right? The bad news for the rest of us aspect in increasing the lower bound. It turns out this step, going from 2 to 4.5, back down to 1.5 to 4.5, under some, what I would call very reasonable assumptions, in itself is a bad step. Why is that bad? Because uncertainty, risk, is costly. Not knowing is in fact costly. So knowing less about what the parameter ought to be, what that link between concentrations and temperatures ought to be, is in fact bad news. Bad news in the sense that the costs of climate change, or by extension, the optimal price on 1 ton of CO2 emitted today, in fact increased due to this step. It didn't decrease. Right now, of course, this is a rather simple way of looking at the world. There's a lot of science behind all of this. A lot of uncertainty, as it turns out, right? So we know a lot about what happens down here. We can cut things off at 0. Ever since 1848, we've known that adding CO2, in fact, increases temperatures. We're not as lucky here on the upper tail. Right? Now, none of this here is going to be likely. Right? Chance is pretty good we'll be here. But of course, we can't exclude things on the upper tail. And by the way, right, there's a lot of critiques that could be launched at this kind of analysis. These 30 or so different studies modeled here, all independent, clearly not, right? The way science works is if 29 studies say this is sort of how it's supposed to look like, and the 30th study comes along and has some completely different answer, the burden of proof is pretty high. So there's clearly a bias toward making these probability distributions look very much like the ones we are used to seeing. Right? But this is pretty messy, so let's get back to a simple picture again. Right? One line, likely range between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees centigrade, was most likely going to happen, 66% probability, and of course then we are looking at this tail. Now, we actually don't care about this parameter. Right? This climate sensitivity parameter. What we really care about is eventual actual temperature outcomes. Not just the link between concentrations and temperatures, but what will actually happen to temperatures. Well, what do we need for that? Yet another, in many ways, highly uncertain number. An estimate of where concentrations of CO2 will actually go. Once we have that, we can calculate what will actually happen. Now, very simple step, making an assumption of where these concentrations go to essentially look at the probability of certain eventual temperature outcomes based on, in this case, a particular number of how much CO2 equivalent emissions will end up in the atmosphere. Turns out this is a fairly conservative estimate in the sense that we have this from International Energy Agency, their estimate for what will happen by 2100, end of this century, under what they call a new policies scenario. So there are already a whole bunch of assumptions baked in on all the great things that are going to happen policy-wise that are not currently on the books in order to limit emissions, limit concentrations of CO2 equivalent emissions in the atmosphere to 700 parts per million. Now, this is more than a doubling of pre-industrial levels, by the way, right? Started at 280, now at 400, 40% increase so far. 560 is the doubling. 700 is 2.5 times where we started. And what we get under this scenario is a greater than 1 in 10 chance of global average eventual temperatures being above 6 degrees centigrade. Right? This sort of puts the shock into climate shock. Right? The sort of the fever analogy might be an appropriate one, right? 37 degrees is average, 39 you're in bed, 41 in the hospital, 43 you're dead. Right? No one has ever survived 43, 44 degrees centigrade body temperature. So these small changes matter a lot. Of course, they do on a planetary equivalent. Testing 1, 2, 3. Excellent. Thank you. So we're looking at this 10% probability of global average temperatures exceeding something that frankly ought not to be crossed, right? So in many ways, the political goal is around 2 degrees, well-founded scientifically in many ways, but certainly a political number to limit global average temperatures to 2 degrees centigrade of average warming, right? And there are already enough things happening at 2 degrees to be worried that that may be a relatively conservative number, conservative in the sense that we should be a lot lower. Well, 3, 4, and 5, of course, are a lot worse. No one would doubt that 6 degrees is what I would call a planetary catastrophe, for lack of a better term, where we're looking at a 1 in 10 chance of exceeding that, right? Or in other words, is the tail that in fact matters, right? Everybody, frankly, guilty as charged for the most part, focuses on what happens on average, the mean, the median, right? The average temperature increase. And yes, these increases are bad enough. Of course they are. But of course, apparently, especially someone coming from the US here, I can say that apparently talking about the averages hasn't prompted us to take the necessary action that is in fact necessary to limit CO2 emissions, price CO2, and limit emissions as a result. But then look at the bottom line here. At the probability of exceeding that, let's call it the catastrophic threshold. Now, it's never truly zero, right? There's always some risk everywhere, right? So like, I don't always wait at the to cross the street to get a green light to cross the street, right? So I clearly don't value my life infinitely much, right? I take risks. And of course, as an economist, right, we are famous for talking about trade-offs and, right, yes, I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old. Well, I don't value them infinitely much either, right? I don't put them in a bubble, a protective bubble. I spend money on other things other than just protecting my children. Now, of course, statements like this is exactly why, frankly, economists are typically not invited to dinner parties, or if they are, they're not invited back. But, of course, it's sort of common sense that this is how we do, in fact, act on a daily basis, right? There are risks. We take them seriously, some more than others, apparently, looking at climate risk here. But, of course, we are somewhere down here when it comes to catastrophic risk, for the most part. Right? There are lots of potential true catastrophes. Frankly, none of them are looking at something like a 1 in 10% chance of blowing up the planet, if you will. That's, in fact, the world we are heading toward under this one scenario here, right? There's, of course, uncertainty here as well. Now, and look at the change, the rate increase here. Right? By the way, when I said we have passed 400 parts per million, that's CO2 alone. Right? When you put in all the other greenhouse gases, I mean, depending on who is counting, it's somewhere between 440 and 480 parts per million. We are currently already, right? So we are already somewhere here in this range. And look at the rate increase down here. That once again truly puts the shock into climate shock. Right, so one of the characters in our book is someone called Bob Litterman, ex-top risk manager of Goldman Sachs, right, an economist through and through in many ways. And of course, as economists, we look at something like benefit cost analysis, right? What are the benefits of taking actions? What are the costs of taking actions? And if the benefits outweigh the costs, we take that step. Now, what do you do when you're the risk manager at Goldman Sachs? Well, you approve or decline to approve investment decisions, right? Investment decisions that on average yield a certain return, presumably a positive one, and I guess if you're Goldman, then presumably a double-digit positive return on your investment. What you also have, of course, in many, many of these decisions is, in fact, a tiny, tiny chance of essentially blowing up the company, right? Losing it all. And the risk manager's task is then to approve or not approve these investment decisions. Now, I won't pretend to know the job of a risk manager at Goldman Sachs. The one thing I do know is if a risk is 10% of blowing up the company, or the planet for that matter, that is not a decision to be approved. Right? I don't know where the true cutoff is down here somewhere, but there clearly is a bright red line not to be crossed, which in many ways goes against the DNA of economists. Right? This is not how we think. We don't think in terms of bright red lines, in terms of infinite costs if a line is being crossed, because we, in many ways, can't deal with infinity. There has to be a finite cost. There are always trade-offs. Right? Now, it turns out, in a decision like this, there simply aren't. There's simply a threshold not to be crossed. And again, I can't tell you the precise number. I know it's certainly not up here at 10%. Now, what does all of this mean in practical terms? Now, in many ways, this is as best as I can give you. There are known knowns, as US ex-Defense Secretary Don Rumsfeld will say. There are known unknowns, and there are unknown unknowns. Well, the known knowns, the stuff we can quantify, the things we know will happen due to global warming at particular degrees, global average warming, calculated through three fairly standard, fairly conservative climate economy models. The US government has done this process, 12 government agencies and his ginormous interagency working group, 3 of these models, a couple of years to come up with this number, and they came up with $40, $40 US. That turns out to be about a third of the level of the current Swedish carbon tax. Now, what we do know is that most of the known unknowns point in one and only one direction. And in many ways, the unknown unknowns, by definition, we just don't know. But the kinds of things that are linked to climate sensitivity, to the deeply uncertain link between concentrations and eventual temperatures, can only go one way. Or in other words, the true price, not just including the known knowns, also including the known unknowns, the unknown unknowns, can only be greater than $40. Given the uncertainties, I can't give you the precise number. Right? Any single digit, any single number would be falsely precise in many ways. What we do know is it's much higher than those $40, possibly right, order of magnitude higher than these $40. In many ways, we simply don't know. So I think with that, I'll show you a picture of my kid again. My 2 babies, turns out. Book and baby. And looking forward to your questions.
Thank you. I think before letting Jonas on the stage, just one question. Are you trying to scare us? Is that what you are doing here?
I'm trying to shake us back to reality. right? So in some sense, sort of economists have, well, there's certain bias towards sort of trade-offs, right? Sort of middle-of-road scenarios, right? On the one hand, on the other hand. And it turns out there's this, what I would call a consensus in economics, false consensus in economics, that essentially says, well, right, there are sort of some estimates that put the proper cost of CO2 pretty high, but there are some others that have it relatively low. So on average, right, $20, $40 seems about right. And in many ways, this US government interagency working group process was supposed to come up with precisely a consensus estimate like that. What this is trying to say is, wait a second, let's take a step back here and figure out what we don't know, and then see which way those results are going to be biased. Is the $40 truly an average, or are there things that would pull us in one or another direction? And frankly, it turns out most everything pulls us in one and only one direction. And that, unfortunately, is this one. So in many ways, right, this is the sort of the brutally honest statement that we don't know, right? Now, we know enough to act. Of course we do, right? If your price is below $40, you know you don't have the correct price. That's a given. What is the exact price that there ought to be? Well, we simply don't know. But it can only be much higher than these $40.
Okay, so you're saying that if we were to have a price in carbon on, say, 40, we're still, the best thing we can do is still to hope that the 10% is reduced to 10% risk is perhaps reduced to 2% risk and never gonna happen.
So in some, right, there's always risks. This is sort of the jaywalking example, right? We can't eliminate that kind of risk entirely. We can make it small enough not to dominate the problem, right? Unfortunately, looking at a sort of 10% risk of these extreme events, these extreme scenarios, right? That pretty much dwarfs the analysis. Once you take that seriously and have a serious attempt of estimating the damages associated with these 6 degrees centigrade of average global warming, it in fact does dwarf the analysis and puts the price much higher than those $40 or $100 even. Right? So it's not about scaring, it's about trying to be brutally honest and trying to be brutally honest about the actual uncertainties underlying this problem.
Thank you. Jonas, maybe we can we keep this perhaps, and you can stand with me over here, and Gernot, please stay on stage. So, listening to Gernot's presentation, do you agree that we as a society or policymakers particular care too little about the outer end of the risk scenario?
Well, yes, I think in this basic thing I completely agree with. I mean, it's not the reason why it's really urgent to do something. It's not what happens with 1 or 2 degrees warming. It's the risk that, of much warmer. I think that is really when things 6 degrees, that means changing the planet. I don't think. Är det bättre nu? Nej.
Ja.
Hallå? Hör ni mig nu? Ja. Okay. Well, I mean, I agree. 6 degrees is unacceptable. That's the basic, and not really because of some economic analysis, but because it's a completely changed world. And I think probably man can adapt to that, but animals, plants, nature doesn't really. So yeah, I agree that is really what we should be concerned with, actually, in that sense. I could comment also on this climate sensitivity parameter. How about if I talk like this? Is this okay? Hör ni mig nu? Är det här bättre? Okay. So yes, this is the most important parameter, and I think this is sort of the holy grail of climate science. I mean, lots and lots of climate scientists try to pin down this value better. So what are the prospects for actually narrowing this range? I don't think this will happen because of better models. And I'm not a modeler myself, but I've talked to people who run climate models, and I would say that they basically agree with me. So there are three, I think in the IPCC report, there are three sources of this range. One is climate models, another one is paleo records, estimates of CO2, carbon dioxide, and temperature change over, for example, the glacial cycles. And the third one is the instrumental record over the past 150 years. And so I think the one of these that we really gradually will narrow down this is actually simply as time passes, we have a longer instrumental record. And we also have, for the past few decades, very careful monitoring of all kinds of factors within the climate system. And that, I would also say that this process is already happening. I read a paper now, rather recent, which is based only on this instrumental record, taking into account how much heat is taken up by the oceans, aerosol forcing, and various technicalities. And they actually arrive at a lower range than this. It's something like between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees. So and this is hotly debated. I wouldn't say there are no serious climate skeptics in the way, but there is actually serious discussions. A lot of people say that this estimate from IPCC is actually too high. So, but I think the answer will come in a coming not too many decades, simply because we have a longer instrumental record.
Yes, right. I mean, absolutely, right. Now that said, right, we know the precise estimate of climate sensitivity a few hundred years from now, right? We will in fact know what will have happened due to a doubling. Now then it's too late, right?
No, I'm thinking a few decades.
Sense,
within a few decades, we
due
can
to the instrumental record, we will know in a couple decades, yes. Now, that said, right, for example, right, and this is now, by the way, an economist arguing with a climate scientist about something very, very much in the climate science world, right? From the paleo record, right, what happened millions of years ago, hundreds of thousands of years ago, we do in fact know last time CO2 concentrations were at 400 parts per million. Where we are today, right? Global average temperatures were between 1.5 and 2.5 degrees warmer than today, and sea levels were up to 20 meters higher than today, right? So even there, right, there's something deeply uncertain.
Yeah, there are things we don't know in this picture.
Exactly, right? No one is predicting, by the way, right, that sea levels would rise 20 meters because of where we are today. Right now, I'm sure there's sort of a small chance that even that could happen, but that did in fact happen 3 million years ago, Pliocene, right? When crocodiles were in Montana and northern US and camels in Canada, right? So a very, very different world. We've been there before. Of course, we weren't around to experience it, right? 3 million years ago, but the planet already has, right? So I think, I mean, again, right, we basically agree, right? It's a deeply uncertain parameter that, yes, eventually we will in fact have a much better idea of what it is. But in many ways, for policy making today, what matters most is that it is in fact so uncertain, and that climate policy, therefore, essentially is a risk management problem. Right? It is not, sort of in statistical terms, a deterministic problem where we know what has to happen in order for something else to happen. It is a risk management problem, right? It's inherently uncertain. We don't know, hence risk management, hence being cautious.
Jonas.
Yes, I agree. I mean, my conclusion, simply not as a scientist really, is that we need to start doing something serious now, and I don't think we have started really doing something serious. And then as the coming decades, maybe 20, 30 years are coming, we will know more, and then we can see how much further we have to go. We have to start something serious now. And to me, that serious thing that has to be done is a carbon tax. Really, the carbon tax much preferred before, for instance, in this paper, there's a Nature paper, talk about subsidies, for instance, people talk about cap and trade. From my point of view, I really think that carbon tax is completely, my judgment on when people start taking this seriously in when they introduce a carbon tax.
Okay, so now we're sort of entering into the discussion of, okay, how to make policy in a world of uncertainty. And we discussed carbon pricing, and I've got two questions, and I'll let you both answer them. One is that, well, if we know that the ppm needs to be, say, 400 or 450 to keep the risk of 6 degrees below 1%, then wouldn't it be preferable to have a cap that makes sure that ppm will never be above 450, say? Or is it the fact that a price on carbon, a carbon tax, how does one deal with the uncertainty? You said that, okay, a $40 tax, it reduces the risk of a 700 ppm scenario, but there still is such a scenario. And then could you then sort of defend imposing just a carbon tax rather than a global cap? Let Gernot begin.
The short answer is, so my co-author here, Marty Weitzman, wrote a paper in 1974. He's slightly senior to me, about prices versus quantities, which essentially started an epic debate among economists of whether we should tax carbon or cap carbon. Back then, of course, it wasn't carbon, it was sort of in general, right, environmental pollution in many ways. But frankly, economists have had this debate ever since. Now, what I would say, I guess, two things. One, pricing carbon can in fact happen through two instruments, two first best instruments, if you will. One is a tax, the other one is a cap and trade system. Right? They are two sides of the same coin. They're actually, as a matter of fact, in economics, two sides of the same graph, quite literally. But you have quantities on one axis, prices on the other, and the two are equivalent in many ways. Now, of course, right, there are in fact long arguments among economists, given uncertainties, given other arguments, which of these two ought to be preferred. In many ways, both, whether it is a tax or a cap, are vastly superior to anything else. It is, in fact, the first best, the most efficient possible measure to get emissions down. This is literally like the one law we have in economics. Literally, we have one law. It's called the law of demand. Price goes up, demand goes down. It works every single time. Right? Economists have looked very, very hard. There are, in fact, a couple tiny exceptions where that doesn't hold. And guess what? CO2 isn't one of them. Price goes up, demand goes down. Pricing carbon is exactly the way to go. Right? Now, that, right? I mean, frankly, this is sort of the gospel that economists have been spreading, frankly, before we knew that CO2 was a problem. Right? So the person who came up with that idea, Arthur Pigou, died a decade before the first Nobel Prize in economics was given out. Right? No one is ever going to win a Nobel Prize for solving climate change. Pigouvian taxes, Pigouvian prices. Now, he was worried about rabbits overrunning a meadow, but of course the principle applies here too. Price up, demand down, and in this case, right, if there is a private benefit but a social cost, the name of the game is to privatize the cost, price CO2 to give me the right incentives. Right? I mean, here's a very quick example, right? So obviously I took a plane here, right? I didn't swim from the States over here to Stockholm. Now, that flight, that transatlantic flight, for me personally, not the whole plane, just me alone, cost 1 ton of CO2 emissions, plus minus a bit. Right? The average American emits around 20 tons of CO2 per year. The average European, 10. Now, I'm a dual citizen, I get 30, but still, right? 1 flight, 1 ton. Now, I'm not saying ban flying, right? Not saying don't do it. Price the damages. Now, we're already paying for these damages that my flight has cost, right? All of us are. Turns out all 7 billion of us are paying for the damages, right? I get the benefit. I get the benefit of coming here. having this discussion, and all 7 billion of us are paying for the damage that my flight has caused. That's insane, right? Why not privatize those costs? I pay the $40 extra, at least the $40 extra for the ticket, right? Which, by the way, is sort of lower than the 9/11 security fee and sort of all these other sort of additional things happening. Sometimes, right, I would say, well, is that flight still worth it? Maybe, maybe not. And many other times I would pay the $40 and hop on the plane. Right? But at least I can do it with a clean conscience because I'm both getting the benefits and I'm paying for the full cost.
Jonas.
Yes, so I think this is the typical message that we've heard from the economists over the past decades. You have to price carbon, and it doesn't really matter that much whether you do it with a carbon tax or a cap. It has more or less the same effect. And I think the politicians have listened to that, and they said, okay, the economists are rational, so we have to do it like they said, and they offer 2 ways forward, and our voters don't really like taxes, so let's go for cap and trade, more or less. I would argue that, in fact, there is a big difference between carbon tax and cap and trade in the real world, and that it has been a big mistake from economists to offer this cheap route with the cap and trade. And let me list 3 arguments for this. The first is that the very idea that you could have a global binding cap is a complete illusion. We've seen that. I mean, people talk about binding treaties and so on. Kyoto was for some countries a binding treaty, and so for the industrial countries. And what happened was that basically many of these countries, they kept under the track because basically as a part of business as usual, a few exceeded the cap, and then nothing happened. You know, there simply cannot be a binding global cap like that in the real world. And the second reason is that if you have a treaty, if you have an agreement on a cap, the economic consequences of these are completely unpredictable, especially for fast-growing countries like China and India. And therefore, they have clearly said that they are never going to agree on a cap. It's completely out of the question that these fast-growing countries will agree on that, and it's easy to understand why. And so I would argue that it's in fact much easier to agree on something where you have predictable economic consequences and not very serious consequences. Everyone knows that a carbon tax on the size that we have in Sweden and also some other countries is not bad for the economy.
Life goes on.
Life goes on. You know, even in China, it would probably in many ways be good for them. It's not. It's not nothing. So if you look from the point of view of China, from a rational, if they behave like rational negotiators, they could very well agree on a carbon tax, but they cannot simply agree on a cap for 30 or 40 years from now. So it's actually from a rational point of view much easier to agree on a cap, on a tax. And a tax is something everyone knows what it is. It's just a domestic tax. You collect it and you use the revenue for things like elderly health care or whatever. So yeah, and I forgot something here, I think.
The third reason.
Yeah, the third reason. What was that? Yes, okay, and that's actually an argument from your co-author here, Martin Weissman, who wrote a recent paper I saw that if you negotiate on caps, it's actually what you're negotiating are then in fact individual caps for each country. And then each country, when it has an interest simply in getting a high cap as possible because then you have a lower cost. And so, but if you agree, if you're instead of negotiating about the kind of a global minimum level of a tax, each country has then, when you try to optimize this level of tax for its own country, you take into account all the reductions that this implies that all the other countries are making. Yep. In his words then, in negotiations about the tax, you internalize the externality, which is exactly what you're doing with the Pigovian tax, right? So if you think rationally about the process of negotiations, it's actually much easier to agree on a tax than on a cap, which is impossible to agree on.
So,
Gernot, do you agree?
Not quite. So let me, so very briefly, right? So yes, if we were to assume that we all globally agree that we will have one uniform carbon tax, right? If that's the agreement, we go into the negotiation, and then we agree, or then we negotiate at what level that tax ought to be. We have, in fact, like you said, a process to internalize this externality, and everything will just fall out neatly. Turns out that's, with all due respect to my co-author, not quite how the real world works. Right? It is not, in fact, true that we've all agreed, globally, all 193 countries, that we will have one uniform tax collected somehow, centrally, more or less, certainly at the same level, and that it could be domestic taxes, of course, but fine, right? But we've all agreed we will have one tax level, right? Newsflash, that's not how the world works. Now, what is, in fact, happening instead, right? So we are not, in fact, negotiating a global uniform cap that applies to the entire planet. I mean, of course, there's the political goal of limiting overall emissions in order for temperature increases to be limited to 2 degrees centigrade, so on. But what is, in fact, happening, right? We have carbon prices. This is now goes covers both taxes and cap and trade in some 50 jurisdictions globally. When I say jurisdiction, right, it's the EU level, European Emissions Trading System. It's at the country level, the Swedish carbon tax. And it's at the state level, for example, in California, in the US, a cap and trade system covering California, for that matter, carbon tax in British Columbia, or a cap and trade system in Quebec, 2 Canadian provinces. Or, for that matter, you mentioned the Chinese before, right? The Chinese are, in fact, experimenting with 7 regional cap and trade trials right now. And President Xi went to Washington earlier this fall and announced that starting 2017, China will have a cap and trade system in place to limit emissions from energy and industrial sectors. Right? So if the question were, what should happen by the world government at the global level, if there were a world government, then yes, right, we can have a debate about should we have a uniform carbon tax or a uniform cap and trade system. Given that really what is happening is that we have, well, 50 so far, but right, many jurisdictions, countries, states, municipalities, regions like the EU, negotiating domestic systems, and not just negotiating, but implementing domestic systems, and in some sense, doing it anyways, right? The EU didn't wait for the Paris negotiations. China didn't wait for the Paris negotiations to announce its cap and trade system. California certainly didn't wait, right? These things are happening domestically. And yes, right, once again, there are political economy arguments going both ways, right? Carbon taxes have the advantage of having a predictable price. That is a true advantage. Well, cap and trade system has the advantage of having a predictable cap. That is a true advantage on the cap and trade side.
And I think I tried to ask this before, and maybe I was not clear enough, but in a scenario where we clearly see in this risk scenario,
Yep.
where we really, really want to avoid certain levels of emissions.
You need a cap, right? You need to limit emissions. Now, of course, this essentially then assumes, right, if we want to limit emissions globally, we need a global cap, which once again, we're the same scenario that essentially, that's not the game we are playing, right? That's not the question we are asking ourselves. Should we have a global cap on emissions at a certain level? What we do have is the EU as a cap and trade system, and yes, right, the associated price with the European emissions trading system is relatively low. That's about €8 or so per ton of CO2. Right, $10 or so. That's relatively low, but that said, right, what is in place in Europe, sort of to full credit to Brussels on this one, right? This is where I proudly pull out my Austrian citizenship and sort of, hey, we've done something. We have emissions in Europe, these 50%, almost 50% of CO2 emissions covered on the EU ETS, go down year after year, right? If nothing happens in Brussels from here on out, literally everyone sort of goes home. Nothing happens at the European level in Brussels. Emissions, by law, go down 1.74% per year, linearly, every year from now through 2020, and then over 2.2% per year, linearly, thereafter. Right? That is an amazing achievement to have that framework in place to do, in fact, drive emissions. And now, should it be strengthened? Yes. Should the associated price as a result then be higher, creating better incentives to reduce emissions further? Yes, but nevertheless, we have that system in place and it works.
I've got a few more questions here on my paper, but given that we've got a little more than 5 minutes, and I think you are perhaps able to pose even smarter questions, I think we open the floor for questions. And while you're thinking about which of your questions you are to pose first, I will ask Gernot about an article that you wrote together with Thomas Sterner and Thomas Kåberger, which you perhaps know.
The Swedish was strong in this one, yes.
Yeah, where you were arguing not only for a price on carbon, but also subsidizing renewables as a way of increasing the price on carbon.
That's the right. So
yeah, and if I may, listening to debates here in Europe, one often hears that, well, the reason why we have a low price on carbon at the moment is that, you know, Germans have been subsidizing solars, and we have all of these domestic jurisdictions subsidizing different sources of renewable energy, and by that you damage the cap and trade system because you have a cap. And then all of a sudden, all these economists say that we need to subsidize renewables to increase the price on carbon. Maybe Jonas also have an opinion on that. Yeah. You will begin, and then we'll let Gernot respond.
Well, a very brief comment on this, then, that clearly this shows the incompatibility between subsidies, I think, and cap and trade. Because if you already have a cap and trade system, subsidies are meaningless, at least for as far as CO2 emissions are
covered on the cap and trade system. You're shifting emissions around.
If you just saw these huge German subsidies simply mean that they're actually subsidizing coal in other countries, basically, without any effect of CO2 emissions. If you would instead, the EU had agreed on a common tax, then these subsidies would have meant something.
Yep. Now, so you very usefully said, right, so the point of that piece, and it was this Nature comment that just very recently came out, and I'm proud to have written it, I'm not trying to backtrack from it, basically says, okay, so now that we live in the real world, and we know that a price on CO2 is necessary, how do we actually get there? Well, one way of getting there is to make the alternative cheaper. Now, is Germany subsidizing solar PV, photovoltaics, in some sense, uneconomically highly, right? Too much. Well, if you calculate the CO2 equivalent price of that subsidy, it's somewhere in 800 euros or so per ton of CO2, right? Now, and yes, right, if in some sense all I cared about was a well-functioning cap and trade system, as we mentioned in this Nature piece, what does this subsidy do? Well, it shifts emissions, right? There's a firm cap. If now emissions go down more in the German energy sector because of all these subsidies, they go up somewhere else under the cap. Now, first of all, right, 2 points. First of all, the cap is still the cap, right? The fact that now the French emit a bit more and the Germans emit less is in some sense, well, between the French and the Germans. But overall emissions are still the same. The planet won't notice. But here's the much broader point, of course. What did the German subsidies, or for that matter, the Chinese subsidies on the supply side, right? German subsidies on the demand side, Chinese subsidies on the supply side. What did they actually do? Well, they helped drive down the price of solar PV. Solar photovoltaic, the cost of solar photovoltaic went down 80% the last 5 years, last 6 years. 80%. That is a huge price drop. Now, was that all due to the subsidies? No, of course not, right? Lots of other factors in play. Did the subsidies help? Yes, they did. So what is the proper reaction then? Well, in some sense, it's for us to brush up on our German and on our Chinese and start writing thank you notes to German and Chinese households, right? They are subsidizing this stuff for the rest of us, so we can now install cheaper solar panels as a result. Now, that's right, an unequivocally good step, I would say. Was it pricey? Did it cost a lot, the subsidy in the first place? Yes. Was it worthwhile? Well, if what we care about in the end is getting emissions down, driving emissions reductions, and frankly, enabling other jurisdictions, countries, states, regions, to price CO2, well, that is now much, much more likely because the alternative is much cheaper.
Okay. Anyone? Otherwise, I will go for the last question. Okay. Please.
My name is Hans Tornell. I'm in the electric ferry business. I'm impressed by the Norwegians because they have NOx tax.
They have, sorry?
NOx tax. They pay $2 per kilo NOx emitted. And then they collect the money in a fund, and then they use the fund to give grants to green investments. Now, I was thinking, you talk about tax on CO2, but I think the big question is, what should you use the money to? Because the tax is okay, but how would you use the money you get in by the tax?
Let me give you an answer that may surprise you a bit, which is, on a first level, I don't care. Give it to Greece. Right? What you need to do is set the right incentives to reduce emissions in the first place. And of course, for NOx, SOx, CO2, right? There's more environmental problems out there than just CO2. It's a big one, of course. But of course, there are other, right, methane or other greenhouse gases out there for that matter, right? And again, price up, demand down, right? Norwegians are proving it with NOx. Turns out the US has had a cap and trade system in place for SOx and NOx, SO2, NOx emissions from the electricity sector. Same effect. Price up, demand down, right? Now, of course, that was a bit of a glib response to basically say, I don't care what you do with the money, right? Now, the first step is, in fact, to set the right incentives and then get out of the way, right? So on the first level, that's the right answer. Now, of course, right, collecting the money and then giving it all to the polluter may not be the right step if what you care about is decreasing emissions as much as possible. So taking the money and subsidizing renewables, as, for example, the Germans are doing, yes, of course, right? So there are better and worse uses for that money. Now, frankly, right, the way the Swedish carbon tax was put in place was a fundamental tax reform, right? Carbon tax went up, other taxes went down as a result, right? Every tax, right, that's not a secret either. As soon as you introduce a tax, any kind of tax, there's some kinds of distortions. Now, for carbon tax, the benefits hugely outweigh the costs. Well, for an income tax, labor tax, payroll tax, there are distortions, right? Like law of demand applies there too. Increase tax, demand goes down. Well, increase the tax on income, less income, right? That effect exists, of course, too. Now, fundamental tax reform, well, one of the better uses of that money is, in fact, to decrease other taxes, or for that matter, well, take the money and subsidize renewables, subsidize the alternative.
Okay, I've got one final question for both of you to wrap this up, or maybe it's two questions within one. Are you hopeful that we will do enough to reduce the risk of those 4, 5, 6 degrees temperature increase, to reduce the risk enough to say it's below, I don't know, 1% to 2% risk? And do you think that the upcoming Paris meeting will in any way help us reaching there?
I have no hope whatsoever that the Paris meeting will help us. I think the whole process now from Kyoto and onward has been basically meaningless because it's concentrated on goals on what 2030, 2050, and setting caps that most people don't have caps, and those that have don't care about them. If you instead concentrate on actual measures that you do implement next year, next 2 years, next 3 years, a tax, you know, even a very low tax, that would mean something. Or actually even agreeing to abolish subsidies for fossil fuel, which some have, I don't know how binding this agreement, there is some kind of agreement on this. This is when you talk action. So far, there is completely wrong focus in the whole process. That's my take on this.
We try to be a little bit more optimistic. So, I mean, my short answer is yes and yes, right? So, am I hopeful? Well, in some sense, right, you'd have to be a real downer if you wake up every day working on climate change policy and you're not hopeful that you can actually make a difference, right? So, there's certainly a bit of that very selfish way of trying to justify what I'm trying to do with my life. But more broadly, right, goes back to the 50 jurisdictions, right? So, once you look at California, the 9th largest economy, 8th largest economy in itself, has a cap on CO2 emissions. 2 Canadian provinces have a price on CO2 tax and cap. 7 Chinese regional trials, right, and a Chinese cap on CO2 emissions starting 2017. India has a $2 per ton tax on coal, not CO2, coal, which is actually one better because this, right, every ton of coal leads to more tons of CO2. Now, they also subsidize coal, right? So, turns out it's a wash. But there are many, many hopeful steps, and frankly, very, very recently. I mean, we are now in this sort of amazing period where, right, South Korea has a cap on CO2 emissions. South Africa is talking about it. Mexico, Chile, Brazil. Right? Amazing advances. Now, are we doing enough already to sort of, go home and start worrying about a different problem? No, of course not. Right? Read the book. There's a shock in climate shock, right? But, well, in fact, actually, in chapter 1, we actually try to sort of literally tally all the optimistic things happening, and it's quite a list, I can tell you, right? And that's the optimistic ending. Now, what is going to happen in Paris? Will we go home and have solved climate change? No, we won't, right? Is it a step in the right direction of motivating countries to be doing the right thing, right? Announcing a cap-and-trade system starting 2017, as in the case of the largest country, right, by population and CO2 emissions, turns out. Yes, of course, all of these are positive steps. Now, of course, much, much more ought to happen. And frankly, actually, on the way in, I saw a paper written called Carbon Clubs, right? Essentially motivating subsets of countries, in many ways, sort of the ones that matter in this. Right? It's one thing to have a negotiation among 193 countries, which is good and necessary in many ways. But of course, at the end of the day, you look at the US, Europe, China, and you have 2/3 of global emissions. Right? Creating a club among those countries, club in the sense of going above and beyond international commitments to do more. Well, in some sense, it goes counter to sort of basic economics in the sense, right, why should anyone move first? Why should anyone do more? Well, it turns out if solar energy goes down by 80% in 5 years, if the alternative is in fact already cheaper without subsidies in many places, sunnier places than Stockholm, it turns out, but still in many places around the world, then that's a fantastic place to be in, and frankly, the trajectory can only go in that direction. Right? It's not a question of if we are pricing emissions, it's a question of when we do it. Now, of course, the when is crucial, and at what level is equally crucial, but still, it's when, not if.
Okay, thank you for bringing some hope, at least after scaring us a bit, and then providing a bit of hope towards the end. Thank you so much for coming here. As said, we will continue do these kind of events. We will be in Paris, then there'll be Christmas, and then spring with a range of seminars here as well. Help yourself to some glögg and pepparkakor, and thank you Gernot for coming here. Thank you Jonas for participating. Have a nice evening.